Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have you in class today. Today's class is all about Article 5, the amendment process. But because our Friday classes are not only engaging and entertaining and fun, they also give us an opportunity to do two things. One, bring in experts from across the country to talk about the topic, but two, also give us great opportunities to dive into unique stories on that topic. So my name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm so excited to welcome you to this class all about the 18th and 21st Amendment, two amendments that changed the Constitution at around the big topic of prohibition. And because that topic is our topic at hand today, we got the best to talk about it today. So Daniel Okrent is the expert that will be leading us in this conversation. And to lead this conversation and ask a million questions is our president and CEO, Jeff Rosen. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jeff to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Curry, and welcome, Daniel. It is so great to see you, and welcome to the Constitution Center's Friday class.
Very nice to see you too, Jeff. Thank you for asking me.
Friends, we are so lucky to have Daniel Okrent teach us today his superb and definitive book on prohibition. Teaches us the story of two forgotten constitutional amendments that tell a story of American history that we can learn so much from. And it's an unfamiliar story, and it's this incredible drama. How was it that within hardly more than a decade, America went from banning alcohol to repealing the ban? It shows us how quickly public opinion can change, how quickly constitutional understandings can change, and it's all told in his phenomenal book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, which will be wonderful weekend reading for any of you who want to take the time to do it. Daniel, I thought I'd just jump right in to the constitutional question. And on our interactive constitution, both of our scholars quote from your book. I'm just finding the relevant provision, but in the 18th Amendment, they note that this is Robert George and David Richards have a joint interpretation of the 18th Amendment. And they say in his important study of both the 18th Amendment and its repeal, Daniel Okrent identifies the powerful political coalition that worked successfully in the 2 decades leading to the ratification of the 18th Amendment. And then this is a quote from your great book: 5 distinct, if occasionally overlapping, components made up this unspoken coalition: racists, progressives, suffragists, populists, and nativists. Tell us about that remarkable coalition and how they came together to pass the 18th Amendment.
Well, it's sort of, Jeff, like the story of the blind men and the elephant, that they each describe it based on which part of it that they are able to feel and connect to. So each of those groups that you mentioned had their own reason for doing it. The nativist argument was the political rise of Eastern and Southern Europeans in the political machines in the big cities. And many of those political machines were based around taverns. For instance, President Kennedy's grandfather actually operated a tavern that was the heart of the Democratic operation in Boston, in the Boston area in the late 1800s. The progressives supported it because they thought it was a way to improve society. And the primary argument of the progressives of that period was that we can use science and we can use knowledge to make things better. And this was going to be a way to make things better. The coalition stretched from, on the far right, the Ku Klux Klan, which interestingly supported the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote because they knew that women were for prohibition and they wanted to have prohibition largely as a weapon against the Catholic political machines. And then at the far left, beyond the progressives, the industrial workers of the world, the most radical labor union in American history, supported it because they saw alcohol as a way that the capitalist class was using alcohol to keep the working man down. So everyone found reasons, and then they came together and buried their differences. Due to the activity of the leading advocate for prohibition, the group was called the Anti-Saloon League. The man was named Wayne Wheeler. He's forgotten entirely today, but was one of the most important political figures in our history. He invented the term pressure group. And he also made the point, if we stick strictly to prohibition and ignore every other issue, we can come together and get this done. And they did that.
Wow, what a story, what an introduction to this incredible drama. Our interactive constitution scholars note that the amendment establishing the income tax in 1913 removed the leading practical obstacle to prohibition, namely that taxes on alcohol had been a significant source of government revenue, and prohibition was now financially feasible. We just jumped right into the coalition. Where do you want to start the story? When did these various groups start mobilizing, and what were the mechanics of them coming together and actually passing a constitutional amendment?
Well, it's a complex story. I'll try to make it simple. It really begins in the late 1840s, early 1850s as a women's movement. Well, not strictly a women's movement. Women were very, very active. I came out of Southern Ohio to see if something could be done about the alcohol problem, which, it must be mentioned, was a severe problem. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much alcohol per capita as we do today. And that's just for American, and that was just measuring Americans of a certain age. And there were many younger than that who were also drinking a lot of alcohol. It created all sorts of social problems. And these women began to organize. One of these women rose at the New York Convention of the Sons of Temperance, which was an anti-alcohol group that was forming in the early 1850s. And she was told she could not speak. The chairman of the convention said, "The sisters are here to listen and learn, not to speak." And that woman was Susan B. Anthony, who then made a total 90-degree turn. And instead of campaigning for temperance, she campaigned for the women's vote so that women could vote against alcohol. So it launched from there. It rises through the Methodist and Baptist churches through the second half of the 19th century, the formation of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the first female-dominated, female-run political pressure group in American history. And then it picks up adherents along the way who have their own interests. Even at some point, it picked up the support of the brewers, who thought that they wouldn't be touched by it, but it would put the hard liquor manufacturers out of business, which would be great for the brewing industry. So they all find their way. But how do you make it happen? And as you mentioned, up until the passage of the Income Tax Amendment in 1913, the adoption of the Income Tax Amendment, the tax on alcohol was the single largest domestic source of government revenue. So once you have an income tax, and so who supported the income tax? The Ku Klux Klan, extreme right-wingers, and people on the left for very different reasons, but primarily for the reason to make it possible to say goodbye to the alcohol revenue. And if I can jump ahead, this also leads to why prohibition ends, because the Depression arrives after 1929, and the government isn't collecting much in the way of income tax. Income tax revenue goes down 33%. There's no capital gains tax revenue. And somebody says, I know where we can get some money back. Let's bring back booze. And it happened like that.
Wow. So centrally important to note the economic realities underlying this. A simple-minded question, but had any individual states banned alcohol on their own before the national amendment?
Yes, many states had through in the Midwest and in the South. One interesting one was Tennessee, which had one of the earliest statewide prohibition laws, which meant that the Jack Daniel's distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee, would be closed down. So they moved to St. Louis, and Jack Daniel's came out of St. Louis until they were able to go back at the end of Prohibition.
How many states had banned alcohol at the time that the 18th Amendment was proposed?
I'm not recalling, Jeff, I apologize, an exact number, but to one degree or another, I think it was more than half a dozen, certainly. And it happened over a period of time. Like Michigan doesn't do it until 1918, right before the national one. But states in the South, Texas was among them, had begun earlier than that. And as I said, in the 1880s.
I ask because half a dozen is significant, but it's not a national majority. And yet at the same time, and it took 2 years for the amendment to be ratified after it was proposed in 1918. Remind our friends who are listening how hard it is to pass a constitutional amendment. It has to be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and ratified either by 3/4 of the state legislatures or by conventions called in the states. For the proposal and ratification of the 18th Amendment, it was state legislatures that ratified. So tell us the story of the drama of ratification of the 18th Amendment.
Well, the key thing to note is that there was never any evidence that even a majority of Americans supported it. We have to remember what the nature of the American polity was in that period. This was before any of the one man, one vote Supreme Court decisions, years before. So, for instance, in New York, one representative from upstate New York represented fewer than 12% of the people that a representative in the Lower East Side of Manhattan represented. Easily then, to get a majority of a legislature, if it is coming largely from the rural districts, which were heavily Methodist and Baptist, and this happens across the country. And then you add to that the political smarts and the political power of Wayne Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League. As I said before, they said one issue only, which meant that in an election between somebody who's a wet against prohibition and a dry for prohibition, let's say for a state legislative seat, a congressional seat, by then even a Senate seat, if we're remotely close, within 10 percentage points, the backing of the Anti-Saloon League for the candidate who was a dry could make the difference, right? They didn't need to get 50% of the voters. They just needed to get that margin of the voters in that district to win. And Wheeler didn't care in contemporary terms if that person that they were supporting wanted to make abortion free and paid for by the federal government and outlaw the words under God in the Constitution and declare war on Russia. It didn't matter. Nothing else mattered but this. So he built a majority by pulling together small minorities across the country.
Wow. The 17th Amendment, guaranteeing the popular election of senators, had been ratified in 1913. Before that, state legislators chose senators. To what degree did that influence the debate, if any, and were some of the senators who voted on the 18th Amendment still appointed by state legislatures?
Some of them, yes, were carryovers. Even some, who had been appointed by state legislatures were then elected. But it wasn't necessary. I saw a question coming up earlier about, what would you do if you could tweak the Constitution today? And I would deal with the U.S. Senate. And as extreme as the imbalance of the U.S. Senate is today, it was more extreme then. So if you are getting 2 senators from North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Kansas, yada da da, outnumbering those from New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and yada, da, da, you can get a lot of things done. And that's what happened with the Senate on this vote.
Fascinating. Could a amendment that lacked national support pass today in a similar way, or has stuff changed in our politics that would make it impossible to repeat that?
I don't think that we could adopt a constitutional amendment that says the sun must rise in the east. The likelihood of 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the states agreeing on something, what could they possibly agree on? Unless there is a radical change in the nature of our politics today, I think we've seen the end of the amendment process. Now, maybe there may be some administrative things like the 20th Amendment, which moved Inauguration Day from March to January. Maybe something like that could happen today. But beyond that, I think it's an impossibility. I think that we've reached the end of the amendment process.
You may well be right. We do have a very exciting project at the Constitution Center that convened 3 teams, conservative, libertarian, and progressive, and asked them to propose constitutional amendments. And the conservative and progressive teams both have tentatively agreed on a term limits for Supreme Court justices amendment and a national popular vote amendment for president. They're going to reconvene at the Constitution Center in May. And we'll see if we can actually agree on the wording, but it would be quite
wow. The national popular vote, for the conservatives to agree to that, that's extraordinary. I hope that, God, that'd be wonderful. I'm all for it.
I have to also share with you my excitement. I have the fake backdrop behind me is the words of the First Amendment. I don't know if you remember the old First Amendment tablet that was outside the museum building in DC, but we've moved it from DC to the Constitution Center and installed it behind me at the National Constitution Center. So
it's great.
Incredibly inspiring space for the Constitutional Convention, and we'll have a great debate. Well, now let's turn to, what a story, what a drama that you tell in this book about the amendment is ratified, and then the Depression changes the economics, and there's a lot of crime, and there's Al Capone, and there's a lot of unhappiness about the way this thing is being enforced, and soon after the amendment is repealed. Tell us the story about what happened in the 20s and how public opinion shifted.
Well, first thing, there was one very clever person who said that the 18th Amendment was ideal for everybody. The dries got their law and the wets still had their liquor. And certainly by 1922 or 1923, on the coasts and in any large city with large Catholic and or Jewish population, you never had a problem getting liquor. The editor of the Detroit Free Press, Malcolm Bingay, in 1925 said it was very difficult to get a glass of liquor in Detroit. You had to walk into a very crowded bar and shout loud enough over the hubbub for the bartender to hear you. And that's 1925. H.L. Mencken similarly said it was easy to get alcohol in Baltimore. All you needed to know was a cop or a judge and you could get it. And so the fact that it was available really kept a lot of people from getting too exercised about it to try to overturn it. Also, there had never been even an effort to repeal a constitutional amendment, so nobody thought it was possible. There were people who took the course of, maybe we can just change the enforcement law, the Volstead Act, and redefine alcohol so that wine and beer might be allowed. There were all sorts of things that kind of were all acknowledgments that this wasn't working. And then one of the leading pro-repeal groups founded in 1928 by a very aristocratic, very Republican, important woman named Pauline Morton Sabin. She said, how can I raise my children to believe in the rule of law when they see law being broken every day on every block in the city of New York? And she gave a credibility to the repeal movement because she was a member of the Republican National Committee, because her husband had been in the cabinet, because she was a social star. She did a tour of the South with some of her allies, and it was covered on the society pages in the Atlanta newspaper and the New Orleans newspapers. Here are these very fancy women saying it's okay to be against prohibition. And given that women had led the movement in, they became the leaders of the movement out. The 1930 election, of course, given the Depression, changed Congress radically to the degree that there were still dry majorities, and it's unclear that there no longer were, which enabled the even before constitutional amendment, within hours of Roosevelt's inauguration in 1933, beer was legalized across the country. That could be done in the context of the Volstead Act. As you said, it took 2 years for the original amendment to get ratified. Many amendments since then have taken 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. The Equal Rights Amendment didn't quite make it after 7 years. The repeal amendment happened in 6 months. It was so clear that it was going to happen. And I found it very ironic that the state that ratified it, that brought it up to the 3/4 necessity, was Utah, which may have been the driest state in the country, but it showed how clearly the American people thought this was a failure.
Fascinating. You tell the story about how Pauline Sabin was disappointed when she heard Herbert Hoover in 1928 take a really hard line on prohibition. What were Hoover and Roosevelt's positions in the election, and to what degree was it an issue?
Well, what Hoover said was, we need to look at it, and I'll appoint a commission, which he did, and which he ignored. He said we have to look at prohibition as a noble experiment. And when Sabin heard that, she said, the experiment's over. It is no longer noble. We have seen its failure. Interestingly, throughout his presidency, Herbert Hoover, well, I should go back to when he was Secretary of Commerce, in the early years of the 1920s, he continued to have his daily martini by stopping at the Belgian embassy on the way home, because embassies, as we know, are not US territory. So it was legal to drink anything in any embassy in Washington. So he became kind of an honorary Belgian and did that throughout his time in the cabinet. Actually, when Hoover, in his late years, he loved his martinis so much, when his doctor told him he could only have one a day, he got 8-ounce glasses. but he could drink them in. So he was a hypocrite. I think that he felt that he was trapped by the Dries who had come to dominate, or at least have enormous influence in the party. Roosevelt had been for prohibition early on when he was in New York, in the New York legislature. He changed his mind. He had his martini every day, always. By the time the 1932 election is coming along, he knows where the wind has blown, and he is very eager to support, with some opposition from his wife Eleanor, who was an alcohol hater all of her life. He campaigned on fundamentally, it was a repeal platform, but the president has no influence in the constitutional process. What he can do is encourage, and what he could do was legalize beer, but he couldn't go beyond that. And I think that's an important thing to remember about the amendment process. It is not at all in the hands of the president, and it's really not in the hands of the Supreme Court. And one of the most interesting cases that came up, there was a case brought by wet aristocratic lawyers in New York that said that the amendment itself was against the Constitution. I said, well, that's kind of interesting, that something in the Constitution is against the Constitution.
I came across that argument when I was a young law student researching the idea of unconstitutional amendments. And I remember sitting in the library and reading those arguments, that it was a violation of natural law to restrain people's choices that way. And as it happens, we just the other day had a discussion with the Indian Constitutional Supreme Court, where the idea of unconstitutional amendments is more accepted. But back to the process of the 21st Amendment. The 21st Amendment is the only amendment that repeals a previous amendment, and it's also the only amendment which was ratified not by the legislatures of the states, but by state ratifying conventions, which is the alternative method for ratification called for by Article 5. Tell us why it was. That
there are a couple of reasons. One was simply to speed the process up. Many states only had legislative sessions that met every other year. That's still the case, for instance, in Texas and several other states. So we don't want to wait for the legislature to get here. Also, the legislatures had been elected by these these rotten borough apportionment. And it was easier to find in many states a mechanism to create a constitutional convention that was made up of people who would make they thought the right decision. Elihu Root, Nobel Prize winner, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of War, a longtime member of the Senate. He was the honorary chairman of the New York Convention. And he remarked in his diaries that this was like nothing else he had experienced in his political life. No one hated anyone else. They were all there to get rid of it.
Wow. So it passed, and did that remove all restrictions on alcohol, or were there some left over?
There's an interesting aspect to that, which is there's one clause in this very short, I believe it's the shortest amendment in terms of words, or maybe not, but very, very short. One clause reverted the authority over alcohol to the states. And that still is present in law in many states in the country. For instance, in New York in the 1950s and 1960s, because the state had authority over any place that liquor was served and gave out licenses, they could forbid convicted felons from performing in nightclubs. And this happened to Billie Holiday because the state law enabled them to use alcohol as their enforcing weapon. Wow. Billie Holiday was shut out of, and many other jazz performers of the period, and other performers. And this came up again in the 1990s in various states about nude entertainment. You can have nude entertainment, but not where alcohol is served, because the states have control over alcohol. And even the most amusing one, Mississippi did not repeal its own prohibition amendment until I think around 1970. But around 1950, they began taxing the sale of illegal alcohol.
Oh. You might as well squeeze whatever you can out of it.
Right. I mean, the level of hypocrisy throughout the period of the reign of Prohibition was astonishing.
The banning of Billie Holiday is so heartbreaking. That was for racist reasons?
Yeah, but there were white performers too who were banned. Chet Baker was banned for a period of time. moralists, can't get away from them.
Well, soon going to be time for me to turn it back to Curry and our phenomenal students who have so many great questions. But what constitutional lessons do you want to distill for our friends about the passage and repeal of the 18th Amendment?
I think that the key lesson about the 18th Amendment, and this may not apply to any other phrase in the Constitution or phrase that could be in the Constitution, that it is impossible to successfully legislate against human desire. Now, if there were human desire in which people were being, I want to murder people, that's different. But the breadth of desire for alcohol was and is such, it just couldn't possibly be made to work. And I think about prohibition. Prostitution. Prostitution has been present in every culture going back, to before the Christian era. And most cultures have tried to eliminate it. And almost none, if not none, have been successful at it. There's just certain areas where the rule of law cannot be applied successfully. And human desire, I think, is the critical one.
Powerfully put. Thank you for distilling that. I can't do better than sum up our great conversation that way. So back to you, Curry, for a few questions from our friends.
And that was a perfect question, because that's what Vicky had asked earlier. What does it say about us that the only amendment to repeal amendment is one that is around this topic, that we have two on that? So that was great point by Vicky.
Actually, if I may, I'd like to make a connection to another amendment, which is the 15th. It's 15th slavery, yes, right?
13th end of slavery, 15th voting rights for African Americans.
The only phrases that have ever been in the Constitution that limited individual activity, not government activity. The Constitution limits government's activity. The only places that individual activity was forbidden in the Constitution was you couldn't own slaves and you couldn't get a glass of beer. So the disequivalence there tells you how preposterous the 18th Amendment was.
Thank you. That was amazing. So earlier you started off with, the 18th Amendment. We have a drinking problem in America, and the 18th Amendment is one of the reasons behind it. The 21st comes in. Do we go back to where we were with that drinking problem? What's the positive outcomes of this mess?
It's a little bit difficult. One measures the amount of alcohol consumed in this country by the tax stamp on the bottle or the can. During Prohibition, there were no tax stamps on bottles, so we don't know how much people drank in Prohibition. We know that coming out of Prohibition, they were drinking at about 70% of the level of the pre-Prohibition level. But even the pre-Prohibition level, as Jeff pointed out before, included many states that where drinking wasn't allowed. So it's not perfect. We didn't get back to the pre-Prohibition level until the advent of wine coolers in the 1970s, something that has happily disappeared from most bars in America. Another remnant of, and this is a little bit of a diversion, another remnant of all of this in the state control is the insane liquor laws in the state of Pennsylvania, and who can sell liquor and where you can sell. That all comes from the 21st Amendment that authorizes the states to do whatever they want with alcohol.
And I think it was the governor, Gifford Pinchot, who was a Teddy Roosevelt aide and was at the center of one of the big scandals in the Taft administration. So his moralism continues to discomfit and disappoint lovers of spirits in Pennsylvania today.
Hysterical. So many things. And now I also want the students to be able to start to notice these things when you're in towns. There are certain towns in New Jersey that still have the blue laws, where you can only go into a store and buy certain products on, Sundays, and they're connected to this. And there is in Ocean City, New Jersey, a tolerance statue. And it was one of the first water fountains in New Jersey, in Ocean City, New Jersey, to give people water instead of drinking other products. And that leads to Neil's question, which I loved. So Neil's question is, in the colonial period, we think of Americans drinking a lot of weak beer and hard cider in lieu of water. Was there a shift to different alcohols later? How did that shift happen, and why? Why were they drinking everybody was drinking, light beers and hard cider. So what is the first reason? And then did we shift to hard alcohol and cocktails?
Cider, Johnny Appleseed wasn't interested in developing the Granny Smith. Those apple trees that were spread throughout the Middle West by John Chapman, his real name, were used to make apple cider. And apple cider was hard cider. And at the Daniel Webster recalled in a memoir that in every home in New Hampshire, inside the doorway, there was a barrel of cider with a ladle. And that was what everybody drank. One of the reasons was, you're right, the quality of water was very, very questionable. The Continental Army, George Washington gave everybody a ration because of the problems with water in some parts of the colonies. In fact, the Volstead Act, which was the enforcement law that came out of the 18th Amendment, specifically allowed the continued fermentation of fruit. Now, that was done for the farmers of the Middle West who wanted to keep having their cider. So that brought in votes that they may not have had otherwise to support it. You were also able to use it in religious ceremonies, which brought in some support from Catholics. It was under the guise of you should be able to use your sacramental wine. The leading manufacturer of sacramental wine, Beaulieu Vineyards in California, was making sacramental wine in the 1920s in 11 grape varietals. They were doing sherry and Pinot Noir and Cabernet and so on. I mean, it was a very interesting phenomenon. I see a note here. It says, "Hence Rabbi O'Shanahan." That's true. That was a story that broke in New York about two rabbis. One was O'Shanahan. I think the other one was McElroy, because they were getting sacramental wine for Shabbos. And yeah, right, Rabbi O'Shanahan. When did the liquor taste change? As the frontier extends, the tavern becomes a singular part of the American social experience, but strictly a male institution. Every town had a tavern, and it was a place where men would, and this leads to the women's rise against alcohol. Men would go there to drown their sorrows, or to have fun, or to engage with prostitutes who were, brothels that were attached to them. They would drink away their money. They weren't able to show up for work on Monday morning. It was a horrible domestic problem, When the taverns arrived, then bottled alcohol became an essential part of it. They weren't all just going to be fermenting apples and distilling it. Another thing that led to it was, if you think of the Whiskey Rebellion, going back into the 18th century, the corn and wheat growers of Western Pennsylvania, to get to market their grain and fill up a wagon with it and go however many scores or hundreds of miles to get paid for it. Imagine how much more you can get paid if you distill that grain and put it in bottles, and you can make 30 times, 50 times as much money. So bottled alcohol comes in for those reasons.
Awesome. Okay, one last question, and there's a million. We could go on for hours and hours. And I'm always looking for the positives. So as some of the ingenuity of the American business people during Prohibition, so taking all these facilities, and again, back to Pennsylvania, where I am, you can walk around one of the largest cemeteries and you see all the big beer distributors having these giant, mausoleums because they had such fortune. Some of them completely closed down, but some of them pivoted and said, we're going to start making other things. So what were some of the inventions that came out of this major shift in change in product?
Well, specifically an alcohol-related product, or to replace alcohol-related product. The key thing that breweries have and had was refrigeration. So turning to products that required refrigeration meant ice cream first and foremost. For instance, in Detroit, where I grew up, Stroh's was a brewery, but during the Prohibition years, they started making ice cream, and they continued to make ice cream into the 21st century. And this happened with many others. The Pabst company went into cheese, dairy products. By this point, Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, they were doing the entire integrated operation. They actually manufactured their own cars and made their own glass. They were, the whole deal. And so they had this fleet of vehicles that had to be used, and they could use that for distributing dairy products, but also for distributing newspapers or whatever else it might be. So the need for change was clear. It also must be pointed out, however, that before Prohibition, there were 10,000 breweries in the US, and after there were 300. Most could not survive by switching to something else.
Unbelievable. And I think it's really interesting to see how much pivot and change, what were all the players that came together. But I think the biggest point that I found so fascinating in our conversations today is when we create a system that tears down the rule of law, we as a society can gather back together and in 6 months reinstill it and not go against the grain of what we believe and want as well. So thank you so much for this conversation.
That's a wonderful point. I really appreciate it.
You made it.
No, you've given it to me.
No, you really made that point, and it's amazing. Like, we have to believe in the rule of law, and it needs to be succinct in our society. Such a fascinating story on constitutional amendments, a fascinating way to look at the behavior of America over time and connecting the dots between people. So thank you so much for this dialogue.
Thank you for inviting me, Curry. It's been a pleasure. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Curry. Beautifully put, Curry. Have a great weekend, everybody. Wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend. Cheers.
Bye. Cheers indeed.
Yingling still makes ice cream now. Thank you, Vicki. I know Pennsylvania, Thank you so much, everybody. That was fast and so much fun. I told you it was quick, Dan.
Yeah, it really was. It was a pleasure. I'm just reading the chat now.
Go for it. Thank you. This was great.
People really got engaged with it. That's wonderful.
Very fun. Oh, we could have the questions. There was a million. We were like, wait, but what about this? What about this? I wanted to go into speedboats too. I was like, we can keep going with this.
Yeah.
Every Friday. You're right, Colin. We get our 8 million questions in every Friday.
Well, what is the difference between Fridays and your other classes?
Wednesdays, we have 2 different classes. One's an intro and the second one is advanced. We dive through, if you saw in the briefing document, like all that content, we kind of,
I see.
Yeah, so we walk them through, like, that's what those questions were like. Okay, here's what Article 5 says. Let's look at how it's changed. So we look at like big scope. And then Friday, we let the scholar come in and kind of pick a story focus area. So we cover less, but it's really, really interesting. And, lets us go deep dive.
Great. Terrific. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for doing this. It was so great to see you.
Nice to see you again, Curry.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.